Good morning, statistics students. Today, what we're going to learn is that fourth part about significance testing, or our one sample z-test. So we had our state that we've learned, plan we've learned, do we've learned, and today we're going to talk about the conclude and how do we do that. So let's get going. When we state something, so let's just start with an example that I just made up on top of my head. State P equals the true proportion of people who studied for the last test. Okay. Now, typically I think, well, I'm hoping it's more, but we're just going to be conservative here and say 50% of people studied for the last test. Now, based on those scores, or on the last scores, I'm wondering is maybe it was less than 50%. Do I have evidence to prove that the true proportion of people who studied for the last test is indeed less than 50%? So I go through the process. I have my state, I go to the plan and the do, okay? So I'm not gonna write out the plan and the do at this point. I'm just gonna talk about it with the plan. We would do that R, the I, the N. We have a one method, or one sample z-test for P, that's our method, okay? And then we go to the do, and the do, we find the P hat, the P, the standard deviation, the z-score, and then we go ahead and we find that p-value, okay? So I'm going to find the p-value for when z is less than negative 2.53. Why did I write it like that? That's one way that you can, it's one way to write the notation, okay? What is the probability or the p-value when z is less than negative 2.53? And why do I know that I'm using a less than? Well, in this case, my alternative hypothesis is less than. So that's how I know that. So just a friendly reminder, how you find that is you go to your Z table, and I have a link for you on Schoology, okay? And I go to negative 2.53, and I have 0.0057. So negative 2.53 gives you 0.0057. And that's what we have here. So let me just get rid of that. Okay. And that's our p-value, 0.0057. Now, what I did is I just wrote down what this notation means, because you are going to be seeing that in your homework today. And I typically haven't used this notation in the videos. But just so you're used to it, you know that this is a less than problem and that this right here is your z-score. We go to the table and we do not need to subtract from 1. Why? Because it's a negative z-score. It's a less than problem. We're good to go. Okay. All right. Now, what do we do with it? Now that we've gone through the state, we've talked through the plan and the done some of the do, excuse me. How do I actually conclude? Bear with me. Stay patient. It's not that difficult, but I don't want you to get overwhelmed by the words here. Okay. What we need to do is we need to set something called the significance level, and that is called our alpha. And alpha can be written like a little fish, like this. But because I'm using the computer, I'm just going to write it out as alpha, okay? If you are not given an alpha value, a significance level, 0.05 is typically the standard one that you use. A lot of the times we will give you one, but if we do not give you an alpha level, use 0.05. Okay, so we're going to set our alpha at 0.05, and this is going to help us to decide what do we have, how we have to make a decision about this null and this alternative. Do I have evidence that less than 50% of people studied for the last test? So what we do is we use this p-value here. And we use this alpha, and that's going to help us decide. So one of two things will happen. The p-value will be less than alpha, or the p-value will be greater than alpha. You have to decide. So in our case, our p-value compared to alpha is 0.05. So whenever I conclude, I set a significance level, and then I'm going to compare the p-value to our alpha. Okay? Now, what will happen here? If your p-value is less than alpha, We state the conclusion a certain way. So what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video, and I want you in a second when I say go, when I say pause, I want you to pause the video and I want you to write down this sentence, okay? Then I want you to come back and I'll explain what it means. So here is our sentence that we use. I want you to pause right now, write the sentence down, then come back. Okay, hopefully you're back now. We would state when the p-value is less than alpha, there are two sentences we use. The first one is about what are we deciding about the null hypothesis, okay? So because our p-value, which is equal to whatever we get for a p-value, is less than alpha, we reject the null hypothesis. That means we don't think the null hypothesis is right, okay? First sentence is about the null hypothesis. The second sentence is then about the alternative hypothesis. When our p-value is less than alpha, then we have evidence for HA, our alternative hypothesis, and we do have to do that in context. What does context mean? Telling the story. So that's one of the first things that could happen when you compare your p-value to alpha. And why are we doing this? So we know how to conclude about our null hypothesis and our alternative hypothesis. The second thing that could happen, and it will be one or the other, it cannot be both, is our p-value could be greater than alpha. And the sentence we use here is pretty similar, okay? The first sentence is about the null hypothesis, the HO, and the second sentence is about the HA. So at this point, I want you to pause the video and write this down, and then I can explain it. Okay, hopefully you're back, okay? When our p-value is greater than alpha, we say because our p-value is, whatever it is, right, is equal to this, is greater than alpha. Now, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. That means we can't reject it, okay? So in statistics, we say we fail to reject that null hypothesis. The second sentence has to be about our HA, our alternative. Now, because we can't reject this null hypothesis, we fail to reject it, we don't have any evidence for HA here, okay? So how does that look? We say we don't have evidence for HA, and again, HA has to be in context. So now what I want you to do is I want us to write the statement in context about this scenario that I've set up, right? I've set up this scenario where I am assuming 50% of people study for the test. That's that true proportion. But for this last test, I have evidence because the scores didn't look so great that maybe less than 50% of people studied for the test. So I gave out a survey, asked how much you studied, went through the plan and the do, I got a p-value, and now I can conclude based on what I see. And our p-value is less than alpha. So this is how I conclude. I look and I use this sentence in red here to help me conclude because the p-value is less than alpha. If the p-value was greater than alpha, I would use this sentence frame right here. Okay, so I'm going to say because our p-value is equal to 0.0057 is less than alpha, we reject the null hypothesis. Almost word for word what I have in this first sentence right here. Now we say we have evidence for, so I said we have evidence that the true proportion of students who studied for the last test is less than 0.5. Where did I get that less than 0.5? This is all of HA. I have evidence that the true proportion of people who studied for the last test is less than 0.5. Okay, we're going to practice it a couple more times. If you want to try and go ahead and go for it on your own because you think you got it, now would be a good time. But if you're still confused, because we are going to have a greater than that we have to conclude, and we are going to have a not equal to, keep watching. I won't take as long as I explain the next examples because I went through, the basic process, but I would like to practice it with you. So let's get going now. Okay, practice number 1. Find the p-value for when z is greater than 1.15. okay? Oops, I showed you too much. Well, that's okay. So what am I going to do? 1.15. I'm going to go to that 1.15. Okay, right? 1.1 and then 5 is right here. So 1.15 gives us 0.8749. Okay? And then I had to subtract one. I had to subtract it from 1. Why did I have to subtract it from 1? Because this is a greater than problem, and you can see that there in my probability statement, and I'm telling you that as well, okay? So I'm telling you right now, our HA was a greater than problem as well. Okay. All right, so hopefully that's clear, finding that p-value. We found the p-value, we went to the z-table to get 0.8749, we subtracted from 1, okay, because it's a greater than, and now we're gonna move on. Would we reject or fail to reject at alpha equals 0.05? This is when I state that, that means what is our conclusion? So we need to look at our p-value right here compared to our alpha right here. And our p-value is greater than 0.05. Now, every once in a while, I get people who get confused by their decimals. Alpha, you could think about it like money. This is 5 cents. This is about 12 cents. Is 12 cents greater than 5 cents? Yes, okay? That's one little helpful hint if you're struggling at all. Okay, so now I'm going to go and I'm going to go to that statement again, okay? Because our p-value is greater, right? We're going to use this sentence right here. So you want to look at your notes at this sentence. Try writing down the statement on your own. Now, we don't have an HA or an HO that we can use in context. So we just use that basic sentence. If you need help, here you go. Because our p-value is equal to 0.1251 and is greater than alpha, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. First sentence is about HO. Second sentence is about HA. Oh, okay. Let's write that down together. I don't have it. This means, right? Or this means we have no evidence for HA, okay? We have no evidence for HA. Now, we don't have the context, so we can't put it, right? But we're literally just taking this sentence right here. I said we have no evidence, we don't have evidence, same thing, doesn't matter. Okay, we should feel good on this problem about finding the p-value and deciding if we would reject or fail to reject based off the p-value, comparing it to alpha. Okay, let's move on to the next practice. This is our last practice, by the way. A test where we have a null hypothesis where p is equal to 0.75 versus HA, our alternative that p is not equal to 0.75 gives us a z-score of 1.02. So we talked about this in the last notes. When your HA is a not equal to, it complicates it just a little bit, okay? So what do? We need to find the p-value first, okay? So I have all my little hidden bubbles here. So I'm gonna go to my z-score table. I'm gonna go to 1.02, and that's 0.8461. Okay, next now I need to decide, do I need to subtract this from 1? And the way I instructed you, and there's other ways you can think about it as well, is I said, when you have a not equals, look at your z-score. If your z-score is a positive z-score, you need to subtract from 1. Okay, so we're going to do that now. So again, just to repeat in case you didn't understand or didn't hear me, the way I instructed you when it's a not equals, right? I find that p-value based off the z-score. I then look at the z-score and say, if it's positive, I need to subtract from 1, okay? So when I subtract from 1, I get this right here, 0.1539. And then when it's not equal to in the alternative, you have to multiply by 2. So my p-value here is 0.3078. So we should feel comfortable now finding a p-value when it's a less than, when it's a greater than, and when it's a not equal to. Next, we have to decide, is the result significant at alpha equals 0.10? Write a conclusion statement. When you're being asked this question, that's saying again, how would you conclude? Look at the p-value, look at the alpha level, compare them and decide. So our p-value right here, 0.3078, is greater than our alpha. So we go to our notes and we look at the notes. When a p-value is greater than alpha, we pretty much copy this sentence frame word for word. If we have context, we put the context when we can. In this case, we don't have any context. Okay, so because our p-value is equal to 0.3078 and is greater than alpha, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. We don't have evidence for HA. Okay, guys, again, just a quick summary. You find your p-value, you compare it to alpha. If it's less than alpha, we reject the null hypothesis. We have evidence for the alternative. If the p-value is greater than alpha, we fail to reject the null hypothesis and have no evidence for HA. Let us know if you have any questions. You guys have a wonderful day.